In tonight's Dateline Defense, an ambitious plan for reform. 30 years ago this fall, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Act, responsible for the way the U.S. military and defense institutions are organized. The world has changed since then, and DoD wants to change with it. Joining me with more is Francis Rose, federal government expert and host of National Defense Week, Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock on WMAL Radio. Francis, before we get to the reform aspect of this story, let's talk about the Goldwater-Nichols itself. What was this bill all about?
Well, this passed in 1986, Morris, and at that time it was the largest piece of defense reform legislation ever passed. The main point of Goldwater-Nichols was to establish a concept of jointness throughout the military, for the military to focus on ways that the individual branches, which up until that time had pretty much operated in their own silos, to work together. And that reform took hold in the late 80s and has expanded until now. But Ashton Carter, the Secretary of Defense, would really like to expand on that concept of jointness and especially take it all the way to the top of the uniform command chain.
All right, fast forward nearly 30 years. The Cold War is over, but the structure of DoD is largely the same. Last week, Ash Carter spoke at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He outlined a few changes. What are they, Francis?
Well, they're pretty major changes, some of them, Morris. One of the changes would regard the way that the Joint Chiefs of Staff are structured and the way that they report information to the Department of Defense and to the White House. The synchronization of resources around the world is one of those ways. It would be the responsibility of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to oversee and coordinate that policy. What Secretary Carter also wants is objective military advice for ongoing operations and not just for what is happening in the Department of Defense at the moment. He would like to see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs involved in long-term military strategy for the Department of Defense. And the third item is advising him and advising the White House on specific strategy and operational plans all across the department.
All right, so on Friday, Carter took his roadshow to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He says plans for U.S. missile defense system in South Korea are going to happen despite Chinese opposition. He wants to deploy THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, on the peninsula. What's this all about?
Well, this is another element of the administration's rebalancing to Asia. A lot of observers believe that this is just the next logical step of demonstrating to China and the other countries in the region, particularly our allies, that we're serious about the ongoing threats in Asia. There are multiple threats in Asia. The most significant ones are China and North Korea, but there are other things going on over there, especially as ISIS and other elements of Islamic extremists start to try to get a foothold in countries like Afghanistan and even some Asian countries where historically they haven't been. So this is looked at by a lot of the experts that I talked to as just the next logical step of that, Morris.
And I wonder if the THAAD deployment is an admission that the North Korean sanctions are not working.
Well, there are a couple of schools of thought about that, and this is particularly difficult because North Korea is such an opaque regime. But one school of thought is exactly as you suggest, that the sanctions are not working and North Korea has a lot more latitude than we'd like them to have, and so this is a big stick that's positioned close to them in order to try to scare them a little bit. There's another school of thought that suggests that perhaps the sanctions are working very well and putting a lot of pressure on Kim Jong-un's regime, and because of the pressure that's on his regime, he's done a huge purge where he's eliminated a lot of the people who have been very close to him in power. And the possibility is that this is just, again, the next logical step of putting more pressure on him to try to force some kind of regime change from inside North Korea. There were rumors this week that he had been deposed. Now, they don't seem to be true, but there's a lot of churn going on inside of North Korea, and one of the schools of thought about this is that this is another opportunity for the United States to add more pressure and try to resolve the situation in North Korea.
Before you go, Francis, let's hit one more story. SpaceX successfully landed a reusable rocket on a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. Fifth time was the charm. Explain why this is so significant.
Well, it's really significant for a couple of reasons. The instant reason, the short-term reason that this is important is SpaceX now has been able to launch a rocket into space and land it back on a drone boat in the ocean.
And it didn't tip over.
No,
As
it
you see
didn't.
on the left,
And
that's
so it can
incredible.
be reused. This is the space equivalent of up until now. If we use the truck analogy, you'd buy a truck, you'd ship a payload to the destination, and then the truck wouldn't be any good anymore.
Right.
This will allow SpaceX to use this piece of equipment over and over and over again if this continues to work. The long-range benefit to that is that it really cuts the price exponentially of getting payloads into space. That's particularly beneficial to the military because space, as it becomes a more contested domain, will require a greater military presence by the United States.
Always good to have you on board.
Thank you.
Francis Rose, host of National Defense Week on WMAL Radio. Thanks, Francis.
It's great to be with you, Morris.